faced with pain and suffering, it's not let me get a God's eye view of this and see what's going on. The book of Job says we won't get that in this life. But what we get is a God who steps into our world and says, let me show you in language you can understand my control over evil and death and my intentions, my purpose, which are good. So I think the book of Job teaches us to live as creatures, I think.
Hello! Welcome to the Bible OverBrew with me, Rachel Redeemed, and Matt Searles. We are here to get into the overbrew of the book of Job. Some may be familiar with it as Job, but we're calling it Job, and we're getting into the whole of it today with our key chapters as 1 and 2 and 38 to 42. If you have not found thebibleoverbrew.com, there will be some notes and questions to guide you from there. Matt, do you have some form of hot beverage?
Yeah, I've got my brew. It's lemon and honey. I'm sort of coming back off a flu cold thing, so lemon and honey. My voice is sort of just about there. What are you drinking, Rachel?
Well, after last episode, I went rogue with some ingredients I was not assuming I would like, and I really liked it. So similarly, I'm not a big licorice gal, but peppermint and licorice, I'm in. So let's give it a whirl.
Peppermint and licorice.
It kind of sweetens the peppermint. I'm kind of here for it, but you know.
Cool.
I'm not expecting you to be you. I mean, the fact you're in lemon and honey, I'm impressed.
They're just two big flavours. Anyway.
To the story so far, do you have a little sum for us as we are partway through the wisdom literature?
In the Old Testament Bible order that we're doing, it's part of the writings. So the Old Testament Bible, the Hebrew Bible order would be the Law, Genesis to Deuteronomy, kind of books of Moses. Then the prophets, which is the former prophets, the history books. The latter prophets, the kind of Isaiah, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, and the 12 minor prophets. And then the last section of the Hebrew Bible order is the writings, which sort of sit by and large out of the main storyline, or at least the first ones do. And as part of them, we've got the wisdom literature. There are a few slightly different orders for the writings in the Hebrew Bible, so we don't want to get too tied up in exactly what comes where. They came together, but some people put things in slightly different places. The most common order is the one we're doing, which puts the 3 poetic books, Psalms, Proverbs, Job, together. And then the 5 kind of little books, as they're known, the little scrolls, and then sort of finishing with sort of more history at the end. As I say, the order doesn't hugely matter, but just if you've seen a listing of books that was slightly different and you think, what's going on? Depends if you're in southern Spain or various places. They had a few different orders kicking around. In the last episode, we looked at Proverbs, and I was kind of saying Proverbs, in a sense, reflects quite a creation order. We see God who created the world. By his wisdom, he founded the earth. By his understanding, he did that. And sort of much of Proverbs is observational wisdom about the world, all under the sort of under the guidance and anchor of the fear of the Lord. But largely it's reflections on life as it should be, sort of life when it's working. If you are diligent in your work, then you'll probably do well. If you're lazy, you'll probably struggle. These kind of things. So very much a sort of a creation order. And just in the last episode mentioned, we're going to need to read Proverbs in conversation with Job and also Ecclesiastes, because a misreading of Proverbs would go, okay, so it's a slot machine then. You put good stuff, hard work in, and out comes good results. I mean, I don't think Proverbs itself commends that reading. So already Proverbs would help us, but that might be a misreading. And Job is really going to be in that kind of world of Job's comforters who are very much sort of misreading things and think the world is a slot machine. Job is going to bring out some really hard questions. And of course, listeners listening will be in different situations. Some might be in real dark times. Maybe this is why folks have turned to Job. And I mean, it's a hard read. We see Job go through some real anguish. There's some real pain in the book. It's being described as wisdom in revolt. Sort of, what do we do when all that we know seems not to be true, and everything seems to just blow up in our face, and life just seems to explode and not work, and God seems miles away? There's some parallels with some of the lament psalms, actually. So Job is going to be this sort of curious book in many ways. It's a book I still find baffling and bizarre in many senses. I think partly that structure, the fact that it's a book we can't very quickly get our heads around, points us to a reality of life and the world that maybe we can't quickly get our heads around it. But it's gonna look at the problem of human suffering, not from a sort of an academic ivory tower perspective. This isn't a sort of a theory of human suffering. Firstly, because actually if someone's suffering, that's not what they need. It's more of a kind of a view into and meditation on someone wrestling on human suffering, and particularly his relationship with God in the midst of it. Is a relationship with God possible in the midst of suffering? I think that's a sort of a sharper focus. So it's certainly not an abstract book about pain and suffering. It'll certainly be something, as we discuss, I'm hoping not to bring a sort of abstract, detached view to it, because that wouldn't be helpful. Rather try and sort of sit in it and with it for a while. Yeah, it's going to be a sort of a baffling book looking at an innocent sufferer and how he relates to God in the midst of it.
I feel somewhat nervous coming towards it, as in the Lord's kindness, in this moment, I'm in a season of ease. But I wonder, even by when I come to edit this or listen back to it, what will my own reflections on what I say be? I think a lot of Job's comforters are described as miserable. So I hope that in this season I'm not also cataloguing myself with the miserable comforters as we jump into a weighty book. We meet this man Job, who seems to be very wealthy, numbers of sheep and camels and yokes of oxen, and he is named as being blameless and upright. And even when his family would be hosting feasts, he would kind of want to give sacrifices kind of just in case something had happened. He was kind of very diligent in that. And then we have this Satan figure speaking with the Lord and wanting to test this man Job, kind of expecting that if his life doesn't work out, he's going to curse God. And he's given permission to do that. And Job's property and his family, his kids, get taken. And then we kind of have that repeat of Satan going back to the Lord, and then Job's health is also taken. And then we get Job's miserable comforters. We meet the Bildad, Eliphaz, and Zophar, the first three, and they come together to show him sympathy and to comfort him. They sit in silence for 7 days, which, 7 days and 7 nights. For some people would say, I think that was the best thing they did, because when they open their mouths, then it all goes wrong. Other people saying, this is a good way to comfort people when you don't know what to say. Actually going to be with someone is worth it. And other people saying they didn't know what they were doing, and so they were just sat there dumbfounded. So I don't know if you have a hot take on which we could lean into, but I think perhaps them not saying things was better than what they then go on to say.
Yeah, I'm very much of the school that they move towards him. It's that thing, isn't it? When folks are suffering, we can sort of move towards and move away. And actually, some of what Job will criticize his comforters for later, chapter 6, verse 21, he says, "You see my calamity and are afraid." And it's just such a wise comment on, actually, I think most human beings, we're slightly scared of suffering. And so someone who's suffering sometimes feels the need to sort of hide away because, and I've sat with people and heard them talk about this, people going through profound things and sort of how they feel pressure to sort of put on a brave face for everyone at church, because people at church just can't cope with what they're going through. And you have this weird thing that they are trying to comfort their friends, but it'll be okay, when actually what the doctor has told them is it probably won't be okay. But often those around them are just too afraid of something like that, and just hearing a horrible sort of pressure, people get sort of forced to put on a brave face just because it's easier for those around them if they're not really struggling. I'll need to know the same myself when folks I love and are near to are struggling, the danger of sort of moving away because it's just too hard. I think just going and sitting with him, he goes, dust and ashes, that's a symbol of mourning. I think they're weeping with those who weep. Chapter 4 onwards, they're trying to fix him. I think that's the problem. He needs someone to weep with him, not fix him. the book's a long book. The first 2 chapters come and go so quickly, but just to see the hardship that Job goes through, losing his possessions and then his family, and still doesn't curse God. And then Satan says, well, but you haven't touched his skin, now afflict him personally with illness, and then he'll curse you, but he still doesn't. And I like to think of Job sort of as a play. If we're going to stage this, how would we stage it? And the first 2 chapters very much are kind of up. We've got the view of the heavenly court. We sort of get the view of God and the angels presenting themselves before him, or the sons of God, and Satan, or the Satan. The word Satan just means accuser. So we get the accuser coming, and it's just, we don't often get pictures like this. So it's slightly unfamiliar. It's some sort of heavenly scene. The Lord says, look at Job. He's upright. He's blameless. He fears God. And Satan says, well, it's only because you've made his life easy. Make his life hard and he'll curse you. And amazingly, Satan is given permission. It's interesting, permitted by God to afflict Job to a certain extent, very much within limits. He's on a leash. And actually, we might say that leash is quite long, and there's mystery. Satan's allowed to afflict Job in some serious ways. That's all sort of at the heavenly court level. Job isn't witness to any of this. Job doesn't overhear any of this. We sort of see what's going on sort of behind the scenes. And it's almost like then the spotlight will then dim for that part of the stage, or maybe it's sort of the royal box in the theatre, and almost from that moment these actors will now look on and see everything else which is happening at the human level on stage. And sort of we're then at the human level, or maybe even slightly below, or maybe we're in the ash heap, maybe we're in the place of death, maybe we've gone even lower. But all the while we've seen what no one on stage has seen, which is we've seen the heavenly courtroom, what's happening. That the Lord is permitting this. I mean, that's strange. The Lord is permitting it to a certain degree, but Job, the friends, they've got no idea about any of this. And so there's this kind of dramatic irony where we know something the characters don't know. And that's going to then sort of set things off. Job doesn't curse God. Twice in chapter 2, he doesn't sin by charging God with wrongdoing. And it's really interesting that right at the start, and actually right at the end of the book, Job will be commended. He doesn't sin, but he does lament and cry. He cries out, basically, I wish I'd never been born. And then after these 7 days, his friends come in with these words of comfort, his comforters, as they're known. But we've said they're described by Job as miserable comforters. I mean, it's quite a lot, this long central section of all these speeches of the comforters. What was your experience of reading that? What do you make of it?
Oh, it's a lot of hot air, it feels, from these folks, and particularly when, thankfully, I'd had some steers that what they say is not necessarily right, meaning that actually it's quite odd in the sense of somewhat you're like, okay, we've talked before, sometimes things are described and not prescribed, we shouldn't mix them up. But when there's chapters of people saying stuff about God's character that you're like, whoa, I need to check that I'm not saying this about the Lord, because these guys are not on it. And then there's a lot of back and forth. So I think it's quite confusing for me, but also there's some poetry aspects to it. There's clearly more going on. As I remember back to Deuteronomy, there was a lot more going on than I thought there was going on. So I want to humbly sit and not overly be like, oh, we could just completely, ditch all this middle back and forth. There is something going on there, but it is somewhat above my understanding, I think.
It's funny, I can't remember reading Job for the first time. I can remember listening through for the first time when I was doing sort of trying to do the Bible in a year, but by that time I already knew the story, and I already knew that at the end of the book God says these people did not speak what was right. He condemns the comforters for what they said. So even though on our first read through we don't know that, I think that's a slightly sort of weird reading strategy, that you're reading all this stuff about God, and then right at the very end it's like, and pretty much everything they said was wrong, or significantly was wrong. Yeah, I just think we need to get that out there. As you said, at the end God will condemn them in his final speeches. And so, I mean, let me just read a few verses and we'll get a flavour of the things they say, and notice how theological they sound. They sound very learned, they sound very pious, and at times they sound like, yeah, they might be nearly right. Some of what they say sounds plausible. So Job 4:17, probably the verse that most encapsulates what they think of Job. They see Job suffering, and they basically think, well, it's clearly because you've sinned. They think God is just, He rewards the righteous, he punishes the wicked. This mechanistic view of the universe, slot machine God. And so they say, can a mortal be more righteous than God? Can even a strong man be more pure than his maker? In other words, Job's saying, I haven't deserved this suffering. And they say, well, yeah, but you must have done. You must have done. And what's really vital is, of course, God has told us Job does not deserve this suffering.
Yes.
God has told us Job is an innocent sufferer. But they continue in this line, chapter 8, verse 3. Does God pervert justice? Does the Lord Almighty pervert what is right? I mean, this is awful. When your children sinned against him, he gave them over to the penalty of their sin. I mean, that's brutal. He's saying, why did your children die? They sinned against God. They got their just deserts.
Wow.
I mean, incredibly, they draw a direct line between sin and suffering. Actually, it gets worse. They say, you know what, Job, you're getting even less than you deserve. 11 verse 6, I'll read the ESV. Know then that God exacts of you less than your guilt deserves. So they're saying everything that's happened to you, loss of family, loss of possessions, loss of health, it's your fault. It's because you've sinned. And in fact, you deserve much worse. So that's their comforting strategy. There's more they're saying, and it's close enough to the truth, as in they're talking about God being righteous. Well, God is righteous, but then they're applying that in a completely wrong way. They're applying it in a sort of a mechanistic way, as if there's just this one-to-one connection between what you do and what you experience, which, I mean, nowhere in the Bible presents that. But they've just got a completely actually wrong view of God and how he works. Actually, if anything, Job is suffering because he's righteous. But they blame Job. And yeah, I think there's so much to learn here for how we walk with those who are suffering, or maybe who we need to walk with us when we're suffering. I mean, maybe just I'll read a few verses of Job's responses to them. Chapter 6, he says, anyone who withholds kindness from a friend forsakes the fear of the Almighty. In other words, they're sounding very pious. They're sounding like they're honoring God, but they're not being kind. And Job is right here. Kindness is a quality of God. We know it's one of the fruit of the Spirit, the fruit of God's Spirit working us. They're not kind to Job, and therefore they're wrong. Really interesting. And when we are, I was going to say, when we're trying to give answers to someone who's suffering, I mean, last time I checked, Job wasn't really asking for answers. But it's vital, isn't it? Because I've so often heard people commenting on those who are suffering. What answers can we give them? And my own probably relatively limited experience is when I'm suffering, I'm not wanting answers as much as I'm just saying, ow, this hurts, and I want someone to comfort me. My questions aren't theoretical at that stage. Actually, they're giving answers. I mean, the wrong answers, but I think even the right answers wouldn't have been the right thing. Kindness is what they needed. And I think partly why they get it wrong is a verse I come back to. Probably the verse I come back to more than any other in Job is Job 12 verse 5. Job says, those who are at ease, those for whom life is easy, have contempt for misfortune as the fate of those whose feet are slipping. In other words, he's saying, you know why you guys don't get it? It's because your life is easy. And because your life is easy, you can't think yourself into the shoes of someone who's struggling. In fact, you probably think they must have done something to deserve it. Yeah, we all have sort of seasons, don't we? And when I'm in seasons of more ease and comfort, this verse reminds me just to be careful I don't let my easy situation mean I'm just harsh with others, because I just find their struggles. Oh, come on, haven't you fixed that by now? It's very easy to have that really condescending view to others who are struggling. And probably what it reflects is actually maybe we're just enjoying an easy life at that moment. And I mean, many moments when we're going to have Jesus pointed to, but you know, who do we need in struggles? Not someone who dispenses their pearls of wisdom as they see them from afar, but actually someone who really gets it from the inside. Maybe folks have experienced if we've struggled in a particular way and no one seems to get it, but then we meet someone else who's maybe struggled in a similar way, and we barely need to say anything at all.
Yes.
They get it. And that's just such a comfort. We need someone who's lived through it, really, or is incredibly compassionate and empathetic. But more often than not, it's someone who's lived through it. They will get it in a way that others won't. And so I think already we're being pointed to our Saviour in what sort of comfort we need.
And we get an interesting turn of events in chapter 9, jumping in at verse 32 and 33. We have he, that's God, is not a mere mortal like me, that I might answer him, says Job, that we might confront each other in court. If only there was someone to mediate between us, someone to bring us together. When I was listening through and a mediator pops up, you're just a bit like, hey, wait, what? Like, what's this doing here?
Yeah, I mean, there's kind of two things going on in parallel here. We get a number of times Job wanting to have his day in court. We get Job asserting his innocence to his friends, but we also get him saying, I want to plead my case before God. I want to have my day in court. This is one of the places. But actually, we get sort of court legal type language quite a lot through this bit. Basically, Job, in a sense, wants to ascend to the heavenly court and have it out with God. Almost put God on trial. That there's something of that sense that sometimes he wants to contend with God, and that's a legal word. But also, alongside that, wanting to have his day in court, there's this sense that, but I'm also going to need to have a mediator. I mean, how can I do that? I kind of need a mediator to plead my case before God, or hear someone to bring us together. And then in chapter 16, Job's saying, my witness or my advocate is in heaven. And it sort of just dropped in. We're like, okay, wait a minute. So Job both wants to have his day in court, but also has a sense that there might be the possibility of someone to mediate for him. But at this stage, I mean, particularly if we're reading it in the Old Testament context, we haven't yet got to the New Testament thinking, what might that look like? But then in chapter 19, I guess these things sort of come to their fullest expression. And these might be some verses that are sort of more familiar, if any of the bits of Job are familiar.
Yeah, let me read Job 19, verse 23 to 27. Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on lead, or engraved in rock forever. I know that my Redeemer lives, and that in the end he will stand on the earth. And after my skin has been destroyed, yet in my flesh I will see God. I myself will see him with my own eyes, I and not another. That's pretty out there, Job. Wow.
Yeah. And sort of, well, certainly I was going to say we're thinking, speak for myself, I'm thinking, where does this come from, Job?
Yeah.
Because so much of it has been protest against God. He's almost describing God like an enemy. And that's what he's sort of just dancing around the edge of, the Lord's arrows are in me. Well, if the Lord's arrows are in you, then he's firing like the Lord is sort of described as Job's enemy, and at times comes close to. I don't think he does ascribe evil to God, because Job didn't sin in all this, but he's sort of wrestling with this. But yet he also has this confidence. I think the first bit, my words are inscribed. He still wants his kind of case to be written down. I think he's saying, I still want my legal case. I want to prove that I'm in the right. But he then has this hope of this Redeemer, this figure. I mean, Redeemer in the Old Testament, it can be used of humans, and we get sort of redeemers in the book of Ruth that we'll see in other places. But primarily the Redeemer is God. So I think Job is probably thinking the Lord here, or at least someone working on God's behalf. He's got confidence in this Redeemer. He seems to have some confidence in an afterlife, which actually, if we'd read earlier, he seems to say man goes to the dust and that's it. So he does seem to have this growing confidence. And I think it's an interesting journey. I think there's just this tension in Job. I read this wonderful phrase by Bob File in a wonderful book on Job. He wrote this: Job's hot and bitter words about God are those of an anguished lover, desperate to hear from the beloved, that he is not hostile.
Mm.
And I just think that's so helpful. Job is someone who fears the Lord. Ezekiel describes Job as a man of exemplary integrity. God says he's righteous. He's not, he's blameless and without grievous sin. Not that he's perfect, but he's walking with the Lord. And I think here, therefore, we get someone who's in relationship with God, someone who loves his Lord, but is just bashed and bruised and hurting and wrestling with this. And so sort of seems like almost he's throwing accusations against God, but yet there's also trust. And I think if we said to him, Job, wait a minute, how does this all work? He'd probably say, I have no idea. But I think he's just trying to put together what he knows about God and his circumstances. And in a sense, he's failing to do that. And I think that's what we'll see at the end. But interesting, this isn't the shaking the fist of unbelief about God. This is someone in a relationship going, I love the Lord, but why and how can my experience now be seeming to contradict that? It's a wonderful promise of hope that, of course, I think we're absolutely right to see this as a pointer to the Lord Jesus, our Redeemer, who lives and will go on, and we will see him. But in the context of Job, I think Job's trying to work all this out. And interestingly, 3 times he says, I will see God, my eyes shall behold him. And that is very much pointing us to the end of the book and the kind of driving us to that conclusion when we hear from God.
And then we get one verse that somewhat chills me. In chapter 38, it opens with, "Then the Lord answered Job out of the whirlwind." And you're just like, oh, I feel small. And then we proceed to have this amazing, lots of questions, but I take it as rhetorical questions, exploring creation and huge things where we see God as big and us / Job as small. Verse 4, "Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me if you have understanding." And then, later we get verse 22, "Have you entered the storehouses of the snow, or have you seen the storehouses of the hail?" Just big pictures of creation. A very big God, I think, is what I'm taking from this.
There's both a kind of a humbling thing for, we feel small. I think also we're supposed to get something of God's incredibly majestic, but also careful, as in full of care, approach to creation, in that he orders things, he governs things, he gives food for different animals. I think the picture here is of a God for whom the world is not out of control. Rather, it's beautiful and wonderful and dazzlingly extraordinary. I think there's kind of mystery, as storehouses of snow and hail. I think our imagination soars. There's a wonderful quote from Chesterton. Job feels the terrible and tingling atmosphere of something which is too good to be told. The refusal of God to explain his design is itself a burning hint of his design. Just get these beautiful pictures of creation, I think meant to blow our minds at the majesty of God, and think, okay, so if this is the God who's ruling things, then my questions and my sort of legal case that I want with him, maybe that needs to be rethought. And so I think there's both a humbling here, but also I think there's supposed to be an encouragement. And I love these chapters to reflect on creation. We've got sort of Genesis 1 and 2 that do it. But these are different chapters that just speak of the variety, the beauty, the wonder, all of which points us to the God who created it. But then we get more questions in chapter 40.
Indeed. We've got Leviathan and Behemoth. I've got to ask, Dino, Rhino, something else entirely, what do we do with these different creatures that we meet?
Chapters 38 and 39 seem to very much have physical creation in view, and Job's eyes are lifted to that, and that's the teaching something about God. Chapters 40 and 41, we get particularly these 2 creatures, Behemoth and Leviathan. I mean, starting with Leviathan, I think Leviathan's easier to sort of place. I have to say, traditionally, they're seen as probably the crocodile and maybe the hippo. I think I'm with I think it was George Bernard Shaw who says, seriously, is God's answer to Job's suffering, can you make a hippo? Like,
Fair point.
they're described in sort of physical terms, but interesting, Leviathan in Isaiah 27 verse 1, Leviathan is labeled as a serpent and a dragon. It's those two serpent, dragon, sea monster words that we've seen right back from Genesis 3. And in Isaiah, Leviathan is described as someone who is coming under God's judgment, a representation of evil. Ezekiel 32 verse 2 will have Pharaoh, that great evil figure in the Old Testament, described in the same language as a sea dragon. So I think we don't need to go outside the Bible to see Leviathan as some kind of embodiment as evil, pictured as this terrifying kind of sea dragon. That's already there in our biblical worldview that we've seen so far. Behemoth is harder because I don't think we get that elsewhere. Interesting, the very end of the word, that moth, is the Hebrew word for death. And so I'm pretty persuaded that Behemoth is some kind of physical representation of a terrifying creature, but really who represents death. And so we get the two great enemies that humanity has faced all along, evil, or the evil one, and death. And I mean, there's mystery here, and I'd hate in 3 sentences to try and say, oh, that's our understanding of these. There's mystery, but I think God is describing these creatures. Evil and death are terrifying. And we don't need to have lived too long in the world or thought too hard to know that, probably. But the picture we get here is of a God who is sovereign over them, and they are not out of control, but they are within the limits that God gives them, which is actually the picture we got back in chapters 1 and 2. The Satan, a very different, sort of almost a cold, clinical description there of Satan, evil, but God gives limits. And this is where the staging, you see, at the end of the book, I think what we're expecting, certainly what I was expecting, was Job eventually gets to ascend to heaven, and God will say, okay, Job, let me sit you down. Let me tell you all that's going on. But Job doesn't ascend to heaven. He doesn't go up to that heavenly court to have his day with God. Actually, the Lord comes down and speaks on that human level. God says, this creation, I'm in charge of it. Even the hardest things that you experience are under my control. That's going to raise loads more questions, of course. But even death, even evil are not outside my control. And amazingly, in chapter 42, that's enough for Job. Job doesn't get his day in court. Job doesn't get to plead his case. But he says, my ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. And we might say, well, you haven't actually seen God. But I think what it means is he's come to see who God is. God, in a sense, God has come to him. Job doesn't get to ascend and see things from God's perspective. The solution that Job gets is God coming down and, in a sense, seeing things from humanity's perspective, coming into this world of mess and revealing himself there. And so for me, that's pointing straight to Jesus. Our answer to, if answer's the right word, but when faced with pain and suffering, it's not let me get a God's eye view of this and see what's going on. The book of Job says we won't get that in this life. But what we get is a God who steps into our world and says, let me show you in language you can understand my control over evil and death. Jesus rose from the grave. Let me show you in language you can understand my intentions, my purpose, which are good. And so I think the book of Job teaches us to live as creatures. I think we're not trying to sort of get that all-seeing perspective, and of course I want that. I'm a kind of analytical type brain, and I want to fix things and know things. And the book of Job says there's lots we're not going to understand, but it's not that we ascend to God, but God comes down to us and makes himself known. And so yeah, it's a strange, in one sense, ending. I don't think it's what we're primed to see, but I think the Lord reveals something more powerful as a result. So do you have a Monday morning moment for us, Rachel?
I feel grateful for this assurance of I'm not going to get certain things that I might want, like the God's eye view, and I feel more content with that, with what I do have, and that's maybe a surprising feeling for me, and I think that's why it's striking me that I'm okay with that in this season. I'm really grateful to have that kind of assurance, to know that this book is in the Bible, to know that we can wrestle with the Lord and not be in sin like Job was able to. It's a hard old line to walk, but if someone has done it, then we can aspire to follow in those footsteps, and to know that, yeah, ultimately I do have a mediator, not just one that takes my case before the Lord in that sense, but brings me into his family, is just the depth at which just the Old Testament folks couldn't imagine what it looked like to have Jesus. And we're just so familiar with having Jesus as our best friend and brother and all of this good stuff that I'm just really struck by the depth at which it's only hinted at and how rich we get that relationship with Jesus. So thankful for that. What about yourself?
It's got to be a this morning moment, I think, because we had a unbelievable sunrise here this morning. Stood at the front of our drive, looking over the hills, and just seeing God's power and majesty in creation points to who he is, but actually how that is to help us in times of suffering, even actually just to let the sort of the bigness, the grandeur of creation blow our minds, to reassure us that the one who did this cares far more about his children. I think there's something of that going on at the end of Job, to let God's creation blow our minds, but so that we might be reassured. The one who spun countless stars into space actually cares far more for his children. And so when I'm to try and view the world through that lens, that's not one just for days of suffering, but I think generally, but perhaps so that when the harder days come, we've got a sort of a bigger view of God. So yeah, I think for me, just because this morning that's what I've been already thinking about, that was lovely to then read these chapters.
Love a good sunrise. We will be back with more, and normally I'd be able to list off some key chapters, but it is the Bible Overbrew, and pretty much for these next 4 short books we're going to cover in our next episode, I would encourage you to skim read if you do not have the time to fully engage in them, which are Song of Songs, Ruth, Lamentations, and Ecclesiastes. The BibleOverbrew.com will have some questions to give you a hand. And we're able to do this because of Good News Broadcasting Association making this recording possible. And until next time, thank you for listening. Take care. God bless. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, that my words were recorded, that they were written on a scroll, that they were inscribed with an iron tool on a lead. On lead.